Hello, everyone. This is Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritually Inspired show. And my guest today is Dr. Jason Loken. With over 20 years in natural health care and 15 years plus of post-secondary education, Dr. Jason Loken is committed to help people reach their optimal health goals. He's a naturopathic doctor, an osteopathic manual practitioner, a former registered massage therapist, and is currently completing his PhD in Integrative Medicine. Dr. Loken is former professor of the Orthopedics and Physical Medicine program of the Canadian College of Naturopathy. He lectures internationally and has appeared on both television and radio discussing topics such as mental health, disease prevention, and the fine balance in managing one's weight, hormone, and stress. In order to best assist his patients, Dr. Loken has completed additional training in the following: Walsh mental health nutrient therapy, neurokinetic therapy, neuro-emotional therapy, quantum touch, yoga, psychology, and therapeutics. He's the author of 2 books, Letters That Move the World, Intentional Acts of Gratitude, and Understanding to Knowing, Unlocking Your Path to Optimal Health. Jason, thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
I would like to start on how, from your medical path, you switched to a more spiritual approach and expanded into that field. What exactly triggered you towards the enhanced consciousness and high vibration?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of a long story, but it wasn't probably just one thing. I think it's sort of an accumulation, and it keeps accumulating. It keeps changing and keeps growing the more that I keep learning and interacting with different people, different patients, do different courses. But I started out as originally I was in school to go into either medicine or physiotherapy. Those were kind of the areas that I was planning on going into. And then for me, I ended up injuring my back when I was at University of Victoria. And so I went and saw a physiotherapist and I got some work done, and it just seemed to me like that wasn't the fit. I couldn't picture myself doing that for the rest of my life. So I ended up seeing another friend of mine that had actually was in his second year at the school for massage therapy, and he worked on my back, and I was astounded at how much benefit I got from it. So I was like, well, I need to learn that. So I left after my second year and I went and did massage therapy. And while I was at school for massage therapy, there was a lot of things that I encountered around that time that really opened my doors to a lot of different things. I dealt with chronic allergies and asthma, and I remember seeing an allergist when I was a little kid, and he said I was the worst kid he had seen in about 20 years of practice. Like everything he touched me with swelled up on my body. So I ended up seeing a naturopathic doctor when I was out there, and that turned my life around. My allergies cleared up, my health dramatically improved, and so I kind of knew that was the path that I wanted to go on as far as when I was thinking about healthcare. The other thing that was really interesting that happened when I was there was I'm 48 now. That was back when I was in my early 20s, and I saw this psychic for the first time that I had heard very good reviews about, and took about a year to get in to even see him, and I was I was open to it, but never had that experience before. But it was a really life-changing experience, because when I saw him, what happened was within the first few minutes, he just kind of looked at me and he sort of went, he goes, this is all wrong. He goes, you're kind of going down this path this way, and he goes, you're meant to be moving in this direction. And he just sort of broke down. Like I had a lot of insecurities at that point, and I had a lot of jealousy and a lot of things that I was sort of caught up in. And he just sort of, it felt like, I was just this open book that kind of got read and exposed, but in a really caring way. But he knew stuff about me that, I barely even knew about me. And it was I think just the honesty that it came up was really quite transformational. He said, because you're supposed to be doing meditation and movement, and he goes, you've got this sort of destiny that you're supposed to be on for healing. You've got work to do. And that that just resonated so profoundly true to me when he said that was probably one of the biggest shifts that got me starting to redirect a little bit. And then that's still a lifetime of constantly working with all these different things, and keep growing and whatnot. But that was such a profound experience for me, because it just, it was just, it's when someone shares something with you about yourself that really nobody else should know, you can't help but have to listen to it.
Yes, and I think that's part of us not being awakened or conscious of what's going on with us. We don't take that time to, to reflect and look in the mirror and ask ourselves, who am I and what's my purpose? And these, guys, these psychics are there to help us. And of course, some are real, some are not. But when we get in front of one of these real people, it's worth, exploring that path.
Hmm. Yeah, and it was whether I think if you haven't had any experiences like that, or you're not brought up with that as being, this introspective part of living, if that's not a part of your childhood or anything, like, you just don't have a set point for it. It doesn't really register. It's not somewhere there that you even would think about going. So it wasn't until it was kind of brought to my attention that, rather than just getting caught up in my own justifications as to why I was feeling and doing things in a certain way, it really halted me and made me kind of take a look. And that really was probably the main shifting point, I think, in my life, that opened up the door to a lot of it. So I came back. I knew I wanted to be a naturopathic doctor. I finished up my university. I went to naturopathic medicine. I also got exposed to osteopathy, which I then did after. But there was a couple of really profound things that happened while I was at naturopathic medicine. So naturopathic medicine itself, I really fell in love with the philosophy, because the philosophy is very much of this holistic look of the body, and an honoring of the innate wisdom inside the body and its ability to heal. And that all very much resonated with me. And so we also realize in naturopathic medicine, you also are looking at more than just a physical layer of health. So you start to look at, and what I've learned in more detail since then, but when you look at health, there's several bodies to health. So there's a physical body that everybody is very aware of. That's usually what brings people in to see a practitioner to get work done, whether they've got chronic pain, or whether they've got a heart disease or asthma or whatever it might be. Those are all the physical things. But then there's these subtle energies that rise above that. And so there's a vital body, which is this energetic body, and that's the world of feelings and emotions. And that's also where we use therapies like acupuncture, or when we talk about vital energy, or chakras, that's all that sort of world. And then above that, there's this mental body, and that's like how we attach meaning to different things. And it makes us have to then investigate things like belief systems and belief patterns. And so much illness starts actually in those layers, and then that filters down into the physical. And then you get above that into the most abstract and areas, which would be more like this body we call this intuitive body, or this wisdom body, and then this bliss body, which is sort of like this direct connection to source. And so when we start to think about health as much more than just the pure physical body, that's going to take you on a journey if you really want to investigate it. And what I would find with patients would be that so much of the time, you the real healing takes place when they're starting to really dive into the work around emotions and mental thinking and meaning and belief patterns, and that a lot of that is where the innate healing really stems from.
I completely agree with you. So I know that people heal their physical body, and then they think they are done. They think they are healed, without understanding that they have to go deeper, as you mentioned, to heal, emotions and trauma. Why do you think that they are not willing to pursue this path, and be open to concepts which maybe they weren't exposed to in the past?
As far as why would patients not necessarily be so open to it?
Correct. Yeah.
Well, I think it also depends on where you are culturally too. I mean, I think it is more open in different places. Like for example, I remember my wife and I took a trip prior to having kids. We went to Bali for a month, and I would say this concept of interconnection and spirituality and everything is very much inherent within the culture, and so. And thankfulness and an idea of how we're feeling being related. So it is there, but I would say in the West, it's not so much. And my feeling around it is that I think for the most part, in the West, we are so head heavy and intellect driven that I think that we often discount our emotions, we negate our emotions, or we feel gut reactions to things, but we rationalize our way to do something different and not necessarily listen to them. So in many ways, I think over time we have become quite disconnected from the innate body wisdom that is there with all of us all the time. And so to even start a conversation sometimes about emotions, it's a lot of times people can't even explain what they're even feeling initially. Sometimes you try to explain what's actually going on and what are they really feeling, and sometimes people know they feel overwhelmed, but to be able to narrow down all the different stages between being okay to being overwhelmed, it all gets scattered. So I think a lot of times people just haven't practiced it. They're not used to it, and that's not the conventional system that we live in. For the most part, the conventional system is there's a physical body, there's a physical reason for your problem, and then there's a physical therapy that you'll take. You'll either take a medication or a procedure to try and deal with it. And that we don't necessarily, that's not a common dialogue to talk about all these different layers that make up the totality of who we are, right?
Yes, and I know as a medical practitioner, you have your limitations in what you can say and what you can think out loud. But don't you think that the board of doctors and the College of Doctors should encourage people to look at alternative medicine, which takes care of the spiritual side, of the emotional side, rather than fix everything with a pill, which is not possible?
Well, and I think too, it's in conventional medicine, it's also more broken down into different areas. So how conventional medicine is really, you've got specialists. And so if someone thinks that then it is coming from the mental emotional world, or they would say maybe psychosomatic, then you're referred to go talk to a psychiatrist or maybe a psychotherapist or something. And that can all be beneficial too, but it's almost like there was a bit of a scientific determinism that ended up happening. So it's like everything gets broken down into almost pieces as opposed to the whole. So in primarily in conventional medicine, they work on specific pieces, and you're referred to different experts to work on that piece. And there can be benefits in that, but within that, I think the aspect of looking at the person as a whole person and how all these things interrelate, that's usually where I think the benefit for like naturopathic medicine or some of the different therapies like Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine that basically look at the person as a whole. And we know that in some ways. So for example, we know, for example, that the gut health has a dramatic impact on how we think and feel. So this is called this gut-brain axis. So, ultimately, you can't separate those things. So, you might go and see a gastroenterologist for a certain problem, or you might be sent to go see a psychiatrist, but they would never think to go and get the gut worked on, and that might be part of what's related to the way that you're feeling on a regular basis, for example.
Yeah, the wholeness of looking at the person, it's lacking, is not there, and somehow later on has to be addressed. You mentioned Thea, which is your wife, and your trip to Bali, and I think you also have a retreat in Bali. Can you delve more into that experience, and again from a spiritual side, and if you tried any local plant ceremonies while there, of course, if you can mention that.
We went to Bali after my wife and I we had gone through 2 miscarriages, and it was at that point where we just needed to take a break. I knew my wife needed to have a complete break and a reset, and um, we just basically sat there and went, okay, where are we going to go? I know the body needs almost 3 weeks for it to really go into a different set, like to really get out of fight or flight and to get back into rest and digest. It needs a little bit of time. So we just sat and said, we'll figure out how to make it work, but let's leave for a month. Let's not take leave the cell phones, leave the everything. Let's just take our backpacks and head off. And so we decided out of a few different places that Bali was where we really wanted to go. And so we packed our backpacks and we headed off. We didn't have any agenda. We just kind of went day to day. We would book Airbnbs wherever we could kind of get them and trekked around the whole island for the most part. And while we were there, I would say a lot of what we did was really just quiet it down. We just really slowed down, you know. And it's not that necessarily my wife and I live a fast-paced life, but it's still, you can always slow it down more, right? And we just took in the culture a lot. We went to a lot of different places. We would slow down. We do meditations. We would I mean, almost anything you do in Bali feels like as you walk through the streets in different places, it's like the spirituality is so interconnected with everything. You know, there's always little ceremonies going on that you can be a part of. There's plays, there's different things like that. And we also got a lot of body work. I mean, we got a lot of massage. I mean, massage was so inexpensive, so we would often get like 2 hours coming back from the beach, and we'd stop and get 2 hours of body work done, and just, you know, it was a really deep relaxation that I felt like we got. And we conceived probably about the 3rd week while we were in Bali, and that's our little daughter Sophie. So she's 4 now. So,
Wonderful.
but no, I didn't take into any plant ceremonies necessarily, but more just a deeper dive into the spirituality. And it was funny, you know, one of the drivers we had one day that would take us around to different places, and there's always prayer before you eat, right? That you're always sort of saying thank you. And he kind of chuckled and he goes, prayer seems really different here than it does out west. He goes, it seems like out west you pray when you want something, and here we just pray to say thanks for what we have. And I started laughing. I said, there's a lot of truth to that. I think, you know, a lot of times when we do pray, it's usually because we are worried or we're scared or we want something to change. And it was interesting. I was thinking that there's a lot of wisdom in that, because when you think about it, even my PhD in integrative medicine is with a quantum physics perspective on medicine. And when you think about it from a bit more of a quantum physics, it's like the essence of what happens is it depends on what you're actually feeling, right? So a lot of times when we even do prayer, and if we are in a bit more of a worried or a fearful state when we're praying, then that's the vibration that we're still putting out, that we are resonating with, that we likely then will be kind of creating more of. So from their perspective, whatever's going on, you're always finding and you're saying thanks for what you do have. So in that regard, then you're starting from that place of gratitude, and from there, that's what's kind of rippling out, which ultimately will keep trying to bring more of that back into your field.
Yes, I mean, Bruce Limpton, Greg Braden, and even Joe Dispenza, they all talk about, you know, feeling the vibration and the visualization of what you want to achieve, and mainly is about
Mm-hmm.
health. And going back to what you said about your trip to Bali and Thea conceiving, is again, our bodies have the property of healing themselves if we slow down, if we put that intention out, and also goes through love, gratitude, all these feelings which, you know, enhance us as human beings. uh,
Mm-hmm.
Going back to you know, your website, I see that you have global shifts. What is global shifts, please?
Global Shifts is a platform that myself and a good friend of mine started to create, gosh, probably about a decade ago. It was it developed after we were working on the book, Letters That Move the World, Intentional Acts of Gratitude. Writing the book kind of opened up the door for a lot of ways of thinking. And we kind of sat and it was really around what do we feel like we want to bring that would be supportive for the world? Where do we want to work with? And so my area is more around health. And my friend, she's a musician. They actually done like their music's been listened by millions. I mean, they used to do a lot of the work for places like World Vision and Operation Smile and stuff like that. And had a big music therapy and did a lot of stuff with music. And so, but the other area that she's very passionate about is education. And so it basically became a platform, and it's still just building, and it's been constantly kind of being revised and rebuilt and doing in different areas. But for the most part, it's going to be the platform where a whole program for school systems called Super Me, which is more of like an empowerment program or an empowering program for kids in school, and um, brings them back to a lot of the fundamental things that are not necessarily taught in school anymore, right? Brings them back to the virtues and different things like that, and how to connect to it, and how to live a life where your life matters, and they really own that and they get what that means and the importance of it. And then there's the whole perspective around health and looking at that, and how we're going to be building that out more is going to be, I think, really more around the concept of building resilience, because I feel like that's something that we all need more in this changing world, is more resilience. So global shifts is sort of this idea where we collaborate with many different people from experts in different areas to try to bring certain solutions that we think are needed.
See, it's interesting because, my children and other children, they learn religion in elementary school, high school. But to be honest with you, I couldn't find one student which will tell me that he believes in God. So I met with some of them, my children's colleagues, and they don't believe in God. They don't have any compass related to spirituality. And I'm a strong believer that the kids should have a connectivity or connection to the divinity, to God, to understand a concept, even if it's not tangible for them to know to hang on. But no religion, it will lead them on the path of spirituality. So why do you think that the school hasn't been able to connect them to that concept, and still they learn it, but they don't get anything out of it pretty much?
I think it's a tricky position for schools to open up the door to spirituality because it's so multicultural. I think what happens is they run into troubles if they use any specific term. It will be offensive to one group or another. So I think that's where their hands get tied as far as bringing it into school. But where I ultimately think connection to divinity or to source, or however people want to connect, even nature or consciousness, or whatever words work for people, I think ultimately for kids that starts with the parents. So I think if they want to be able to have kids connect to that, then it's going to be through their family ultimately. I think that's where everything gets, at least in the first 7 years, that's where pretty much everything is just downloaded without a whole lot of thought around it. It's really just sort of ingrained as patterns. But after that, as they get a little bit older, then I think then you can explore it more. Like for my life, I mean, I was brought up in the United Church, so sort of a Protestant upbringing. United Church is a very loose aspect of the church. I mean, my experience with it was really great. I feel like we would go to class or Sunday school, and we would just have these fun lessons and activities trying to bring home certain messages and whatnot. Nothing was really too heavy or intense. I never felt any real guilt around things or anything like that sometimes can come with certain organized religions at times. But it wasn't until I was really probably later on in my life, after I'd had that experience in massage therapy, and then really sort of mid naturopathic school and on, I think was when I really started to question it for myself. Prior to that, I almost think that as kids, if it's a lot of times I don't think we are, as children, I don't think we are given the openness to explore stuff like that ourselves. I think for the most part, it's sort of brought to us as far as what maybe even the families do, right? I mean, if you're brought up in a certain, if your family's Catholic, then you're brought up Catholic, or if you're Jewish, you're brought up Jewish, and that's all fine. But it's just sort of part of what's there. You're not really asking yourself those questions at that point in time on whether that, what that means to you, or is there more, or is there, how does that resonate?
Yeah.
That stuff sometimes happens later on, I think, if you start to question things yourself.
I mean, based on my experience, religion divides and spirituality brings us together because it's much more knowledge and much more common ground into spirituality, in my opinion, at least. And I can accept any person from any religion if they come into the or under the umbrella of spirituality, because the common ground is, or the common goal is the same, to evolve spiritually as human beings and reach God or the divinity and get enlightened. So again, doesn't matter if it's a Jewish person or Catholic or Christian Orthodox, that spiritual path should be a common path and bring us together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely know there's some controversy around religion versus spirituality and whatnot. I remember hearing it one time. It was mentioned. It was like, for people that follow a certain religion, it's sort of like they found what worked for them. For people that are looking for spirituality, they're constantly sort of seeking for something else. They're looking for more around it. And for some people, religion, I think, can be really, really valuable for them. For some people, it's like, even if that process is they go to church once a week, and that provides a certain sort of guideline for them that helps them live their life in a way that's more meaningful, then that's fabulous. I think generally, in my mind, whether it's religion or spirituality, ultimately what you're always looking at is something expanding your life, or is it constricting your life? And so I would look at that on anything. And so if I was in a specific spiritual group, or if I was in a specific religious group, if I found that it started to feel like it was keeping me more restricted rather than this feeling of openness and connection and expansion, then that would not resonate with me. So I would kind of look at that as being a way of then deciding myself what feels best for me at a certain point in time.
Correct. Let's switch to your books. Letters That Move the World first. They talk about gratitude, intention, awareness, and in one of the chapters, the science behind gratitude. How do you apply gratitude in your life, and what was the the main drive to write a book?
Well, I had an experience when I was in my second year of naturopathic school, and I remember sitting there and just randomly reflecting on just how did I end up where I was at that point in time. Just one of those experiences where you're sitting and for no other reason, it just started to reflect on a lot of things. And then it started to get me thinking about just all of the different people that really impacted my life and helped to shape who I felt like I was. And I just started going through the list in my head of all of these different people that really influenced my life in so many ways. And there was two people that really jumped out at me, and it doesn't mean the other people weren't important and played a big role, but my grandma popped out at me because she was such an unconditional, loving energy that I was so blessed to have in my life. Like, that's all I've ever knew of her. Where sometimes it's hard for parents because you're parenting, there's this and that. But grandparents can have a very unique role that way. They're separated enough from the disciplinary part of it that they can just love you for who you are. They're usually at a stage in their life where they're not going through the same stressors of life in the same way. So it can has the potential to be a really, really beautiful relationship, and I was so fortunate to have that with my grandmother. And so many things that just her presence and who she was really resonated with me, and helped to shape who I was. And the other person was my karate instructor, my sensei. I started martial arts when I was little and did it for a long time, competed at a high level for a long time, trained in Japan for a long time, and he was a very big influential part. Karate was a big part of my life for a long time, and it wasn't just my karate instructor and sort of how much I valued the teachings that I learned from it, but it was the community that I got connected with through him as being the hub that held the community together. And it was through the people in that community that made such they I couldn't even picture where my life would be without all of those people, because they all influenced me in so many specific ways, even around what I was doing for career and everything. And so as I was thinking about it, I got welled up at just the thought of how much appreciation I had for them, and to the point that I needed to sit down and write it out to them. So I wrote a letter to my grandma, and I wrote a letter to my karate instructor, and I mailed it out. And it was just a very transformative experience. And it was a very spiritual experience for me, because I remember feeling um, just this sense of lightness, this sense of interconnection, and when you do have experiences like that, it's they just stay with you, and you change from it. You never really go back, because you've had a different gateway that's kind of open, so you experience life differently. But the really fascinating part with it was that I remember talking to my grandma. I was in the middle of writing the Letters That Move the World, Intentional Acts of Gratitude, and so I was back home visiting my grandma, and my grandfather had recently passed away, and my grandma was now living in a community home. And I went and stayed with her for a couple of nights there, and I took the book and I read her the the intro of how she was one of my heroes, right? And I talked about the letter, and she just smiled at me, and then she walked over to her dresser, pulled the dresser drawer open, and took out my letter that I gave her 10 years ago. And she said she keeps that letter and she reads it every night before she goes to bed. And
Beautiful.
that was so impactful for me, because it part of the what happened was, it was this concept of, when I was talking with my friend Corey, who I wrote the book with, we shared this experience. So we had a conversation around, I was talking to her about my experience in school, and she had a very similar experience with her mom that she wrote a letter to in appreciation. And we were talking at the time about how it made us feel, like how it transformed the way we felt. And then we just started thinking, man, like everybody should really connect into that feeling and write letters to people. And could you imagine how much people would feel if they all started doing that? And then we literally stopped and looked at each other and we went, could you imagine what would happen if everybody did that at the same time? Like, what kind of a shift in consciousness could actually happen? And so that then became the mission. And then we need to write a book on how to do that. And so that's where it all started. But what was really fascinating was that while we were in the middle of writing the book, and I went to visit my grandma, that my grandma had that letter, and it made me think, like, holy smokes, like the simple act of connecting to your heart and writing a letter of thanks to someone that meant something to you, and to let them know what kind of an impact that can have on that person's life. I mean, that my grandma read that letter every night before she went to bed, and she had a couple of other cards and letters from other members of the family, whether it was like a thank you letter or something like that, and that was a part of her routine. She would read them before she went to bed. So it just made me think how the simple act of sharing your heart can go and have this ripple effect that goes on and on and on for so much longer than you can sometimes imagine.
Yeah, there are small gestures, as you said, it won't impact only the person who will receive the gesture, but it will impact us as well, and we'll become much, much better, and will understand, the concept of gratitude. How do you use the concept of gratitude in your daily life?
For the most part, I feel like it takes a little bit of practice first, because I don't think coming to gratitude is our default pattern. I think most times our default pattern is to more look for what's going wrong. It's almost like we're almost hardwired a little bit, even from an evolutionary standpoint. The way that our brain works is we're geared more for protection and survival. And so we naturally look towards almost what's wrong rather than what's right. But it takes a bit of practice. And I think once we start to make it a bit more of a priority and we slow down, and that could be as simple as plan that when you sit down to have your meal, you take a moment, whether it's a pause to just be thankful for what you have, which is not rocket science. Like that is, it's like that really was what a lot of times families did growing up. I mean, grace before food was not a, I mean, that was a standard thing a lot of families did. I find not so much now. I think people are just busier. It's hard enough to even get the family to sit down together, you know. But it's just making an intention that you want to start to look for it. And what I found was that it really changes everything in your world when you do. And it doesn't have to be just gratitude. I mean, we do an exercise where we have people in in like an auditorium that has rolls of paper lined out throughout the whole auditorium, and everybody stands somewhere in the auditorium, and then they have markers and they make a big circle around them and they decide what do they want the start of their ripple to be. So we chose gratitude because that was what we connected with, and gratitude is also a really powerful field that can create a lot of shift in the world, and well, it shifts in their life, which then shifts the world around them. So gratitude is a really powerful one, but it could be with kindness. It could be with love. It could be with cooperation. It could be with whatever you want the center of your ripple to be. But the idea was they'd start with that. And then the next layer out would be, so how do they embody that? What does that mean? How do they live their life if you are making, say, kindness the part of your ripple? How do you become kindness? What does that mean? So you make it sort of actionable. What does that look like? What does your world look like when you're doing that? And then you ripple it out to what kind of effects is that going to have on the people around you? And then you start to kind of jot down what that looks like around you. And then you start to go globally, what kind of effects potentially can a movement like that have in the world around you? And then you start writing those things down. And what people are seeing is, because when we talk about the ripple effect, we use the acronym MORE. So we say it basically brings more into your life, and MORE stands for my own ripple effect. And so what you start with, you ultimately bring back into you. And this is the same as like when we were talking about with Bruce Lipton and Joe Dispenza and Greg Braden. It's like, it's very much a frequency. So it's like these different feelings or these different virtues have a frequency attached to them. And when you align with it, and the only way you know you align with it is when you feel it. And that's why feelings are so important. Is explained one time that the feeling in the electromagnetic field, the feeling is the magnetic part of the field, and the way you're thinking is the electric part of the field. And together, how you think and how you feel is what generates that electromagnetic field around you, which is what interacts in the world around you.
Yeah, so you have to
So,
put appearance, pretty much.
so you connect with it. So the first part is to really connect to it. So that means we use our memories of, and now it's easy. I've got little kids, so it's quite easy for me to connect to a feeling of love or to gratitude. I can picture my 2-year-old doing something really cute, and I get that warm feeling in my heart very quickly, right? But what was really neat with this exercise is that as they keep building, and they're doing big ripples, right? It's like this, there are all these people in the auditorium. And eventually what they find is when they get out to the last ripple, their ripple is now overlapping with other people's ripple. So what they're seeing is what they're sending out, they're actually now starting to see receiving back inside and coming back to them. And most of it is these same types of things that we're ultimately wanting to create in our lives.
Understand.
So that's actually we're actually in the process of putting together and really doing a bigger push, because we haven't done, what the book was really a trigger for so many different things that we wanted to start to do, and we hadn't really pushed too much the actual book itself. And now with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, I feel like that is actually a very needed thing. I mean, we are, as a global community, I don't think we have ever been as interconnected as we are right at the moment. Now, it's an interconnected that started through a little bit of fear and worry and concern, but within that, there's also love and appreciation and things and connection that happens too. But it shows us how quickly we are all interconnected. And if we can now use the concept of appreciation and gratitude and build on that, I think that it is a really timely space at the moment to be able to connect people through gratitude.
Yes, and your project is similar to one I have in mind. It's called Letters to Water. So we can influence the quality of water all around the world by writing, love letters or what type of letters we want. But again, it's
Mm.
a very time-consuming project. It will come forward someday. Uh, Going to let's talk about your second book, Understanding to Knowing. What you can you tell us about it?
Understanding to knowing is definitely more on the health side. So we look at a couple different pieces. So the concept of understanding to knowing is, it was really when I had kids, I used to quote unquote understand when my patients would talk to me about having kids and what that would be like, and even them trying to eat certain foods and all these different things. But I didn't really know it until I had kids myself. So the idea around this from a health perspective is this concept of sometimes we think we understand things to a certain point, but once we really integrate and we bring some of these concepts and we start to do them and we really feel the shift that can happen inside of our bodies, now we know what our bodies are supposed to feel like. And so I break down different aspects of that. There's concepts of tracking specific health determinants that allow people to reconnect with their body, because in a lot of ways I think most people are very disconnected from their body, and it's not a hard process to reconnect. We just have to start the process of checking in, asking it, slowing things down a little bit, taking a little bit of time. And sometimes that can be as simple as done by questionnaires. At the end of the day, what was your mood like? What was your energy like? How was your sleep for the night? What was the quality of it like? You just go through certain things and just in some self-inquiry, and you start to see patterns, right? And people start to notice things. So part of it's looking at that. There's another whole section around specific testing that I think is really important to get done. I am a big proponent of the difference between normal and optimal. And I mean that in our lives, on how we feel. And I also mean that on how we look to assess where we are. So from a health perspective, what most people feel is normal is not optimal. So many people think that having a certain degree of sluggishness or some creaky and achy bones or headaches or stomach digestive issues or this or that's just all part of normal. Or you get over a certain age and that's just normal. And they really start to believe that. And the reality is most of the time, none of that's normal. And so the book helps people figure out the steps to get back there. When we look at something like blood testing, and that was one of the sections of that book that I give away as a free ebook called the Top 10 Lab Tests. So that basically looks at some of the top lab tests that I think are just routinely not done, or if they are done, there's a reference range that is so large that healthy populations tend to live in certain zones that are much different than where the entire reference range is. And a good example would be something like stored iron called ferritin. If you are 10, then you're still considered normal, or if you're at 300, you're still considered normal. But a lot of people need to be maybe like around 100 to feel their best, for example, or over a certain amount. And so a lot of times people still have a lot of symptoms, and we call these functional imbalances. So they're not diagnosed with a pathology, but they have this myriad of functional imbalances where they know they don't feel right, something's off, but they get their blood test back or they get their physical exam and they say, great news, everything's normal, no problem. And you leave kind of feeling, well, what the hell's wrong then? Because I know something's still off, but it's like, but I got a clear bill of health. And I mean that first really resonated with me when I saw my sister after she had had her first child. And it was a really challenging time. The baby wasn't sleeping very much at all. My sister was not sleeping at all. And she was just very stressed, super anxious. She was starting to feel depressed. And kind of gets summed up that it's like, you're a new mom, you're not sleeping, that's all just part of what can happen. And it's like, that stuff drives me crazy when it just stops there rather than taking a little bit of a deeper dive and just seeing, because often, even if you were just stressed and not sleeping, well, that has dramatic effects on physiology in your body. It has dramatic effects on the utilization of different nutrients in your body. There's a lot of things that can happen. It plays with stress hormones. So it's like you can mediate that stuff in a lot of different ways. So I remember seeing her, and she said, no, I got my blood test and everything seemed fine. I'm like, well, let me see them. Let me see what was done. And so she was a prime example of where her iron was at 11 or her ferritin was at 11. And a lot of sources would say you're not really solid in your iron levels until you hit closer to about 70. We have these ranges of iron deficient, probably iron deficient, possibly iron deficient, not iron deficient. And so she was at, I think, 11, like literally right down the bottom. And her B12 was also like right down to the bottom. And none of the other stuff was really checked. So we reran stuff. She had a bunch of functional things that were out of balance. And once we just started to kind of get her levels back into optimal zones, so many things just started to disappear. She was able to cope with her world a lot better. The stress started to go away. And so just to kind of say, it's not always just situational. Situational can have a big impact, but there's always more that can be done. So the book was that part of the book really came to me where I'm like, I need to write about this because I see this all the time in clinic. When I routinely check certain things, most of these markers are outside of optimal zones. And when they get into optimal zones, I just find a lot of people's weird symptoms often just start to disappear once they get into these optimal zones. Without having to then treat every symptom individually, it's like the body now has what it requires to manage. It's important to remember that nutrients and minerals, like vitamins and minerals, they're cofactors in the smooth running of so many different reactions that go on the body on a second by second basis.
Yeah, and it's sad to see that these ranges change every single year. I mean, I was able to see it on my own blood tests, so I can compare them. I keep them and I compare them year by year, and I can see that it's going broadband. It's like from this like that, and again, they put you in the category where you are fine, even if you, as you mentioned, you don't feel great. So I don't know how we're gonna deal with this type of situation, because it comes from the medical field. We have to kind of trust them and believe that what they tell us is the real stuff and the good stuff, and we'll have to sometimes take care of ourselves, go to, as I said before, alternative medicine or other doctors which will go deeper into what we really need.
Well, and it's interesting too, because people have access to so much information now. So it's not in the days of like when, my grandparents would go to the doctor or something and just sort of take everything as that was it. You don't question it, right? People now are privy to a lot of information. I mean, patients, if they have a certain condition, or they often know more than the doctors do. I'll have some patients that come in that know more about their condition than I do because they've been researching it for years. And it might be something that's an odd situation, an odd condition that I'm not used to seeing so much. So a lot of times now, patients are also demanding a little bit more from their caregivers, and both in what they want to get checked, and also I think in a relationship that they want to have with their caregiver. There's a certain dynamic that I think people are asking for more than what they used to. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think it's causing everybody to have to rise to create better care for people.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I recommend everyone to buy the book and give it a read. Shifting gears now, what do you think is the state of the world's consciousness at this point? Do you think we'll be able, as humanity, to increase it and shift to the next level, or are we going to stay where we are?
Well, it's definitely interesting times, that's for sure. I feel like what usually happens at really big, before you hit really big transition points, they usually come to almost a bit of like what seems like a crisis. And what I like to remember is that old saying where the Japanese word for crisis is kiki, and it's made up of two kanji characters. One of them means danger, and one of them means opportunity. And so, how I really do believe is that whatever life throws at us, we try to do the best we can with it. I mean, my grandma used to say, Jason, she goes, no matter how much I would like to change what happened, sometimes you just have to do the best you can with what the good Lord gives you. and and it's just so true. It's like there's no sense in fighting the fact that sometimes we are where we are. But given that we are here, how do we use that as best as we can at this point in time? Like, this is a really important time where they feel like if people are at home and they're not working, don't sit and drown yourself in Netflix and everything. I mean, it's fine to do little bits of that here and there, but it's like it's a big opportunity to stay awake. It's a big opportunity to refine what you want your world to look like. A lot of people are waiting for until the world gets back to normal. And this is the time where I would be questioning what part of normal did you not like or was not working for you before? Or not just for you, but for the world. Like, what parts do we need to maybe make transition around? And we've got this big pause at the moment where I do think that we need to be very reflective around things and stay awake and be open and look to see what, because ultimately any consciousness shift that's going to happen is going to happen from enough people creating personal shifts which will ripple out to create a global shift. That's the only way that it works. So the only way, and what happens is when people are in a fearful state, we don't operate from the part of the brain that allows us to move into higher levels of consciousness. I think Joe Dispenza talks about it once. He says, we actually go into the part of the brain that makes us more animalistic and less divine when we are in fear states. So, and you can feel it. You can feel it. You can see it in social media. You can see it in lots of places. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of worries. There's a lot of fear, and I get it. And there's lots of reasons for why that stuff is. I mean, if people are out of work and they don't know what's going to happen, and they're self-employed or fearful of getting a virus or whatever it might be, it's like there's lots of stuff out there that's pushing buttons for people. But I think regardless of the fact that well, that is happening. So we kind of accept the fact that we are in this position, and now how do we do the best we can for ourselves and for our loved ones and for the world around us? And to me, that is using it as the contrast. So I find a lot of times one of the best exercises when I find stuff happens that I don't like or that doesn't make me feel good is it's just information. So it's like when something surfaces that I don't like, or if I find myself caught in getting into a pattern of discomfort around it or frustration around it or whatever, that's fine. A lot of times those emotions are supposed to come up. They need to come up. There's some volition to some of those motions. They're moving us towards something. But then it's to try to help me shift it so that I can, because whenever you're shown something you don't like, the flip side of it is to shine a brighter light on what you do want. And so my perspective is when that's going on, then what do I want to be focusing on? What do I feel is going to be of the greatest service for me at this point in time, right? And for others. And so then when stuff comes up that you don't like, you try to flip it in and focus more on what it is that you want to, rather than getting into this ruminating cycle of focusing on all the stuff that you're worried about and the fears around it, because it just doesn't help. I get how easy it is to go into it, but it just doesn't help. And you have to consciously make that choice to move away from it and refocus. And ultimately, that's the only way you're going to move towards what it is that you want. You have to create a clear vision of what you're wanting to move toward.
Like any shift requires a critical mass, and that might happen, through love, compassion, and we discuss gratitude instead of, force, brutal force, or any physical action. That might be more appealing to those who, are trying to encroach on our rights. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you can have shifts in consciousness in either way. So it kind of depends on what the consciousness level is of the populace. But what's really fascinating is when if you've ever read any work by Dr. David Hawkins, he was one of my main mentors for a long time, and his main book that he wrote was Power versus Force, and he talks about the levels of consciousness. And what he found was that it's even more important to have, even if you had a few people that resonate at a higher level of consciousness, that influences the masses. So if you take someone like Gandhi, for example, so his scale would be from 0 to 100. Anything above 200 is beneficial, anything below 200 is more detrimental. And the level of 200 is that courage. And so below that would be things like everything from pride and anger and grief, and right down to the bottom being sort of shame, guilt, fear, which are basically very just low powerful fields. So you don't have a lot of power to make big changes in your life, for example. And there's nothing wrong with having those feelings when they surface to help you, to bring information to try and help you shift, but that should be what they should be there to try and help you move. And so the goal would be, you start to live your life at a level of 200, the level of courage, and then you can gradually move to things like acceptance and willingness, and then all the way up eventually to these higher states of like love and appreciation and joy. And so Dr. Hawkins would talk about people like Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and they would calibrate up in the around 700. And from being at such a high place of consciousness, they impacted millions, right? So to me, that's somewhat where the whole concept of why it's so important for every individual, and it's through every individual action that we create change in our loved ones and in our community and then ultimately in our world. But it's it's like there's no sense in trying to think, how do I fix the world? It really needs to be start with, how do I really get into alignment myself? That's really it. That's really all your job really is keep trying to find ways of getting into alignment and then just live from that place. And from that, I think, is where you get in inspired action on what you want to do with it. But our goal is really just, that's all our job really is. I remember Dr. Hawkins saying, stop trying to fix the world doesn't need you. It's more like just focus on yourself, and that's all it is. And sometimes I think we get caught up in trying to fix the world because it's easier to think outside rather than go inside and look and do the work that often we need to do.
So true. So Jason, we are approaching the end of the interview. How can people get in touch with you?
Easiest way is to go to a couple of the different websites. So if you go to drjasonloken.com, that's my website where you'll see everything around naturopathic medicine and healthcare and whatnot. I have a podcast called the Inspire Health Podcast, and that's at www.inspirehealthpodcast.com. And then my wife and I also created a platform called Adventures in Joy, and that is adventuresinjoy.org. And that's more of our experiential piece. So where we run workshops or retreats, we run a inner circle that we call it, which ultimately is the inner circle idea, is that it starts within that first circle within yourself. But one thing that we find is really important, and that we usually find after retreats, is that people have real significant shifts that last for a chunk of time, and then the habituation of getting back into their life and surrounded by the rest of the world and their families, they start to find themselves going back to old patterns again. And so we created that as a way of creating community, because it's really important to have spiritual community. You need to be connected to like-minded people that keep us afloat. And I think it was the Buddha that even said the next Buddha is going to be Sangha, and Sangha is the word for community. So spiritual community is very important. Dr. Hawkins used to talk about that too, the importance of spiritual community. So we created that as a way of meeting with our tribe every month and having conversations around different things. We usually offer different movement and meditation classes along those lines too. But I think the real gem of it is being able to reconnect with people and have conversations about things, or have exercises that we might do, or just sit down and field questions.
Jason, thank you very much for all your positive thinking and all your initiatives, which will bring the good vibration in the world. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Until next time, everyone, love and gratitude.